So today we're going to review something that's really complicated actually, and that's the relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen. And I think what makes it difficult is that students think that atoms and molecules have, affinities for each other that are fixed. And the truth is they're not much different from us in the sense that what a molecule is going to do or what an atom is going to do depends a lot on who else is around and, other variables. And I think hemoglobin shows this really, really well. So the relationship between hemoglobin and oxygen is very dynamic. And that's one of the reasons why it's such an amazing protein. So we're going to start with your friend Flops, who you've seen before. And I started thinking about this when I started thinking about getting a taxi cab ride. And of course, Flops is too small to drive. He can't, reach the wheel and the pedals at the same time. So he relies on his friend Quackles. This is Quackles the duck. Quackles usually does the driving, but sometimes Quackles isn't available to drive and Flops has to take a cab. So I started thinking about cabs and what a great analogy that would be between what hemoglobin does and what a taxi cab driver does. Because really the question is, what determines whether or not hemoglobin is going to load or unload oxygen? So that is to say that the protein hemoglobin can either pick up oxygen, which it does in the alveoli, we call that loading, and it can unload oxygen, and we call that, it can give up oxygen, which we call unloading, and that happens in the tissues of the body. But how does hemoglobin know what to do? How does it know if it's supposed to load or unload? So I started thinking about the taxi cab driver because it's kind of the same thing. What determines whether or not a taxi is going to load or unload passengers? And this is a really, really cool analogy because there is absolutely one thing that is the most important that will determine whether or not a taxi cab will load or unload passengers. More than anything else, if a taxi is going to pick up people, there have to be people to pick up. So the number one most important thing is how many passengers there are. So if there are tons of passengers, like you have, for example, at an airport, then taxis will be able to load. They'll load them up. If a taxi drives by a corner and there's nobody there, I know this seems kind of stupid, but obviously they can't load passengers if there aren't any. Okay, so that's going to be the number one most important factor, how many passengers there are. Is there anything else that's going to come into play here that will determine whether or not a taxi will load or unload people? If you've ever been to a city like, I don't know, New York, you know that there is a really, really important factor, and that is the attitude of the cab driver. Now, this is real. This guy was a cab driver who basically got out of his cab and started fighting with another cab driver, and I really don't know why, but his pants were falling down. And anyway, so sometimes the cab driver's attitude really does, have a huge play in whether or not it's going to pick up or unload passengers. Okay, so you got that. Anyway, how this relates to hemoglobin and oxygen is the following. The most important factor that determines whether hemoglobin is going to load or unload oxygen is how much oxygen there is. And we symbolize this with the partial pressure of oxygen. That's a big P with a subscript O2. The partial pressure of the environment, that's in millimeters of mercury. That analogy is how many passengers there are. In other words, hemoglobin can pick up no oxygen if there is no oxygen around. So a high PO2 favors loading, and a low PO2 favors unloading. The second thing that's important is what we call oxygen-hemoglobin affinity, and that, in the analogy, is the cab driver's mood. So this is how much does hemoglobin want the oxygen. So a high affinity means the hemoglobin really wants oxygen, so that favors loading. But a low affinity, say if the hemoglobin is equivalent to the pissed off cab driver, it favors unloading, right? That's the guy saying, get out of the cab. So what determines mood, basically, or affinity, is a lot. And the only way to really answer this question and to really understand what's going on is to look at everybody's favorite thing, the hemoglobin-oxygen dissociation curves, and you will need to draw these, so make sure you understand how they work. This is a hemoglobin-oxygen dissociation curve. On the Y, you have the percent oxygen saturation of hemoglobin going from 0 to 100%. The X is the environment. It's the number of passengers. We represent that as the partial pressure of oxygen in millimeters of mercury. A resting cell has a PO2 of about 40 millimeters of mercury, and in the alveoli, you have a partial pressure of about 100. This is a function of the air you're breathing. Okay, so for example, if you go up in altitude, that's when this number will go down. But how you read this graph is basically it's a sigmoidal curve. When there are no oxygen molecules, there is no O2 saturation. And as the amount of oxygen goes up, hemoglobin starts loading, and that's what you see here as it increases. At a resting cell PO2, how you read this is you go up here and then you read across to the Y and you see that at a resting cell partial pressure of oxygen, about 75% of the hemoglobins are loaded. So about 75% of all available spots in all the taxicabs are full. That's what that means. Up in the alveoli, if it's about 100 millimeters of mercury worth of oxygen, if you go all the way up to where this curve intersects and you go across to the Y, sorry, it's hard to do that, you're somewhere around 95, maybe 97% saturated. So that means in the alveoli, the hemoglobin is almost all completely loaded. Okay, now with the next graphs, we can show exactly how the environment can affect the affinity of hemoglobin for its oxygen passengers. So this is how pH affects affinity. The curve we just looked at is this middle curve, which is sort of an orange color. That's a normal cell pH of about 7.4. So what you want to do is understand how does a drop in pH, say this curve, how does it affect affinity? So if you just pick a PO2, so we're going to pick 40 because that's a typical resting cell. What you do is you notice that at 40, this green curve at pH 7.2 intersects, or I should say, if you read straight across and you see where it would hit on the Y, it's about 62, 63%, as compared to what we saw in the previous one and what you see at 7.4 here, which is about 75. So as the pH drops, you see a shift of the curve to the right. The shape of the curve does not change, but the entire curve shifts to the right. That represents a decrease in affinity, because at the same concentration of passengers, less spots in the cabs are full. Okay, if the pH becomes more alkaline, so here at pH 7.6, and you hold that PO2 the same, so here it is at 40, now look across to the Y and see how high it is. It's somewhere like 85%. So as the pH increases, hemoglobin loads more. That is called a left shift. Other things that affect it include temperature. So here, compared to the normal, 37, when we increase the body temperature, say to 43, this is extremely high. This is just to show you in a measurable way what happens to the curves. These aren't necessarily physiologically relevant, right? But at 40, and again, I'm just picking 40 just for comparison, you see a right shift, which means hemoglobin is unloading faster. And if you decrease to 20, look at that, it's almost 100% loaded. That is a left shift. Something else we can look at is PCO2. You should notice that this correlates with blood pH, and from the lecture you know precisely why. So you see that, so this is normal, PCO2 is about 40. If PCO2 goes up, we see a right shift, hemoglobin is unloading. If we decrease the PCO2, we see a left shift, which represents loading. So hopefully these graphs are starting to make some sense to you. I show this one in class too, just to show the difference between fetal hemoglobin and maternal hemoglobin. And once again, demonstrating that, you know, even when it comes down to protein structure, a mother's work is pretty endless.